I went down and everything went silent, his gun still smoking, blood splattered on my face. My SEAL Admiral thought he'd killed me. He had no idea what I'd done before that shot was fired. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Your support means everything to me as I tell you this story that nearly cost me my life. You know what they don't tell you about betrayal? It doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people you'd take a bullet for. The people you trust with your life, your mission, your brotherhood. And when it happens in the teams, when it comes from someone wearing the same trident you earned through blood and hell, it cuts deeper than any enemy blade ever could. Admiral Marcus Kane. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 silver stars, a bronze star with V device for valor. On paper, he was everything a SEAL should aspire to become. Decorated, respected, feared by our enemies, and revered by his men. I looked up to him once. Hell, we all did. He had that presence that filled a room, that voice that could rally troops or strike terror into the hearts of terrorists. He was supposed to be one of the good ones. But you want to know the truth about heroes? Sometimes they're just villains who haven't been caught yet. It started small. Little things that didn't add up. Mission parameters that changed at the last minute without explanation. Intel that seemed too convenient, too clean. Equipment manifests that didn't match what we actually received. At first, I thought it was just the fog of war, the chaos that comes with operating in the shadows where most of the world will never see what we do. God, I was naive. The first time I really noticed something was wrong was during a mission in Syria. We were supposed to extract a high-value target. Someone with information about chemical weapon stockpiles. Standard snatch and grab. But when we got there, the compound was empty. Not abandoned empty, but prepared empty. Like someone had warned them we were coming. Kane's explanation was textbook. Intel went bad. Happens all the time out here. But his eyes told a different story. There was something there I'd never seen before. Relief? Satisfaction? I couldn't put my finger on it then, but it ate at me. 3 more missions. 3 more intelligence failures. Each time, Kane had the same explanation, the same look in his eyes. And each time, I felt this growing knot in my stomach, this voice in my head telling me that something was fundamentally wrong with what was happening to my team, my brothers. But you don't question an admiral. Not when you're just a chief petty officer trying to do your job and keep your men alive. You follow orders. You trust the chain of command. You believe that the man with more stars on his collar knows more than you do. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how they get away with it. The real turning point came during a briefing for what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission near the Turkish border. Kane was going over the operational parameters when something he said made my blood run cold. He mentioned a weapons cache we were to avoid, specific coordinates, specific intel about what was stored there. But here's the thing, that intel wasn't in any of our briefing materials. It wasn't in any intelligence report I'd seen. So how did he know about it? I started paying attention. Really paying attention. To the missions that got scrubbed at the last minute. To the equipment that went missing from our armory. To the way Kane would disappear for hours at a time with no explanation, no accountability. To the encrypted communications he'd receive at odd hours that he'd never share with the rest of the command staff. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture started emerging that made me sick to my stomach. Marcus Kane, the decorated admiral, the man we trusted with our lives, was selling us out. Not to the enemy. That would have been too simple, too clean. No, he was selling out our missions, our intel, our weapons to the highest bidder. Arms dealers, smugglers, anyone with enough money to make it worth his while. Those failed missions? They weren't intelligence failures. They were sales opportunities. He was tipping off targets, selling weapons from our caches, using his position to orchestrate a network that was getting people killed while lining his pockets. The worst part? He was good at it. Careful. Professional. He used his reputation, his record, his decorated service as a shield. Who would ever suspect Admiral Marcus Kane of treason? Who would dare question a man who'd bled for his country, who'd earned his place through sacrifice and valor? But I was watching now, and what I saw was eating me alive. I started documenting everything. Every inconsistency, every suspicious communication, every mission parameter that didn't make sense. I kept detailed logs, encrypted files, evidence of patterns that painted a picture of systematic corruption at the highest levels of our command structure. The rage was building inside me like a pressure cooker. Every day, every mission, knowing that the man responsible for our safety was the same man putting us in danger. Knowing that while we were out there risking our lives for God and country, our own Admiral was profiting from our blood. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, that couldn't be dismissed or explained away by Kane's reputation or rank. That's when I decided to become a ghost in my own unit. I started monitoring Kane's communications. Not officially, I didn't have the authority or the clearance. But when you've spent years in special operations, you learn how to move unseen, how to gather intelligence without leaving traces. I used every skill the Navy had taught me, every technique I'd learned in the field, to spy on my own commanding officer. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Kane wasn't just selling information. He was orchestrating entire operations designed to facilitate his criminal network. Missions that put us in specific locations at specific times so his contacts could move weapons or personnel without interference. Intelligence gathering operations that were really reconnaissance for future sales. Extraction missions where the real objective wasn't the target we rescued, but the materials we inadvertently helped transport. We weren't SEALs anymore. We were unwitting mercenaries in Kane's private war for profit. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't take it through normal channels. Kane had too much influence, too many connections. If I went to anyone in the immediate chain of command, word would get back to him before any investigation could begin. I needed to go higher, outside the normal structure, to someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. That's when I remembered my call sign. Every SEAL has one, an encrypted identification code used for emergency communications directly with Naval Special Warfare Command. It bypasses all intermediate command structures, all potential points of compromise. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation, when a SEAL needs to communicate with headquarters without going through potentially compromised channels. I'd never used mine before. Never thought I'd need to. But this was exactly what it was for. I spent weeks preparing my transmission. I compiled every piece of evidence I'd gathered, every documented inconsistency, every suspicious communication. I cross-referenced dates and times, matched up mission parameters with unexplained intelligence failures, created a comprehensive file that laid out Kane's entire criminal enterprise in excruciating detail. But I knew I'd only get one chance. If Kane suspected what I was doing, if he caught wind of my investigation before I could transmit the evidence, I was dead. Not disciplined, not court-martialed, dead. A man willing to commit treason against his own unit wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a witness. So I waited. I watched. I prepared for the moment when I could safely transmit without detection. That moment came during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Kane had scheduled a 3-day field exercise at a remote training facility in the Nevada desert. Standard operational procedures, survival scenarios, team-building exercises. Nothing unusual about it. We did training like this all the time to keep our skills sharp. Except this time felt different. Kane was more nervous than usual, more controlling about the communication protocols. He insisted on handling all external communications himself, claimed it was part of the exercise parameters. No personal communications, no contact with the outside world until the exercise was complete. That's when I knew. This wasn't training. This was an opportunity for him to handle some business without oversight, without witnesses. We were going to be isolated in the middle of nowhere while Kane conducted whatever illegal activity he had planned. It was also my opportunity. On the second night of the exercise, while the rest of the team was participating in a night navigation course, I broke away from the group. I told my swim buddy I needed to check some equipment, bought myself maybe an hour before anyone would notice I was missing. I hiked to a ridge about 2 miles from our base camp, somewhere with clear line of sight to the satellites I'd need for encrypted transmission. I set up my communication equipment, powered up the encrypted transmitter, and began uploading every piece of evidence I'd compiled over the past months. It took 43 minutes to transmit everything. 43 minutes of sitting in the desert darkness, watching the progress bar crawl across my screen, knowing that if anyone discovered what I was doing, it would be the last thing I ever did. But the transmission went through. All of it. Every file, every piece of evidence, every documented pattern of corruption and treason. It was all uploaded directly to Naval Special Warfare Command with my call sign attached, bypassing every potential point of compromise in our command structure. I packed up my equipment and made it back to base camp just as the night navigation exercise was concluding. No one had noticed I was gone. Kane was nowhere to be seen, probably off conducting whatever illegal business he'd planned for that night. I thought I'd won. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The next morning, Kane called an emergency briefing. Said we had a new mission, high priority, immediate deployment required. He seemed agitated, more intense than usual. Kept checking his watch, kept looking at his communication device like he was waiting for something. The briefing was standard stuff on the surface. Intelligence gathering mission, potential hostile contacts, standard rules of engagement. But something about it felt off. The location was too remote, the intelligence too vague, the mission parameters too open-ended. And Kane kept looking at me. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but I caught him glancing in my direction more than once during the briefing. There was something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After the briefing, as we were preparing our gear, Kane approached me. "Chief, I need you to come with me. There's something we need to discuss about the mission parameters." His voice was calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent there that set every alarm bell in my head ringing. This wasn't a request. It was an order. And refusing wasn't an option. I followed him away from the rest of the team, out toward the edge of the training facility where the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. We walked in silence for maybe 10 minutes until we were completely out of sight and earshot of anyone else. That's when he stopped and turned to face me. "You know, Chief, I've been thinking about loyalty lately. About what it means to be part of a team, part of a brotherhood. About the things we do to protect each other, to protect the mission, to protect the interests of our country." He was standing maybe 10 feet away from me, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, but his eyes were cold as winter steel. "I've been thinking about what happens when someone in that brotherhood decides they know better than their superiors. When they decide that their personal sense of right and wrong is more important than following orders, more important than maintaining operational security." That's when I knew he knew. "Admiral, I'm not sure what you're getting at." "Oh, I think you do, Chief. I think you know exactly what I'm getting at." He drew his weapon then, not quickly, not aggressively, just a smooth, practiced motion that put a loaded pistol in his hand pointed directly at my chest. You see, the thing about encrypted communications is that they leave traces. Digital footprints. And when someone with the right connections, the right resources, decides to track those footprints, they can learn some very interesting things. My blood turned to ice in my veins. He'd found out about my transmission. Somehow, someway, he discovered what I'd done. I trusted you, Chief. I brought you into my confidence, made you part of my inner circle. And this is how you repay that trust? By spying on me? By betraying everything we've built together. Built together? Admiral, what we built was based on lies. What we built was treason against everything this uniform stands for. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. But at that point, there was no going back. If he was going to kill me, at least he'd know that I knew exactly what kind of man he really was. His expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. The last pretense of civility, of professional courtesy, died in that moment. You have no idea what you've done, Chief. No idea what you've destroyed. The arrangements I had in place, the relationships I'd built, the delicate balance I'd maintained to keep this unit operational and effective. You've torn all of that down with your self-righteous crusade. Self-righteous? Admiral, you were selling us out. You were using our missions, our blood, our sacrifice to line your own pockets. You were committing treason against your own men. Treason? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Chief, you're more naive than I thought. You think this is about money? You think I was doing this for personal gain? Then why? Why betray everything you swore to protect? Because the world isn't as simple as they teach you in basic training, Chief. Because sometimes the only way to protect your country, to protect your men, to protect the mission, is to work outside the official channels. To make deals with people who exist in the gray areas between right and wrong. That's bullshit and you know it. You weren't protecting anyone. You were serving yourself. His grip tightened on his weapon, and I could see his finger moving toward the trigger. You know what the real tragedy is, Chief? You could have been part of something bigger than yourself. You could have understood that sometimes the greater good requires us to make difficult choices, to compromise our ideals for the sake of the mission. But instead, you chose to be a Boy Scout. You chose to believe in fairy tales about honor and integrity. Those aren't fairy tales, Admiral. That's what the uniform means. That's what the trident means. That's what our brothers died for. Our brothers died because the world is a complicated place, Chief. And sometimes the only way to prevent more deaths is to get your hands dirty. To make deals with devils. To become something the textbooks would call a villain so that the heroes can sleep safely at night. I could see it in his eyes now, the justification, the rationalization that had allowed him to live with what he'd become. He'd convinced himself that his crimes were noble, that his betrayal was patriotic, that his treachery was actually a form of service. It made me sick. No one will find your body out here, Chief. This is a training accident. A tragic loss during a night navigation exercise. You fell into a ravine, broke your neck. These things happen in training. Everyone knows how dangerous these exercises can be. He raised his weapon, aimed it directly at my head. I want you to know that this gives me no pleasure. You were a good SEAL, Chief. You would have been a great one if you'd learned when to look the other way. But you couldn't leave well enough alone. You couldn't trust that your superiors knew what they were doing. His voice dropped to a whisper, and I could hear my own name in his words, spoken like a funeral prayer. Goodbye, Chief. I'm sorry it had to end this way. The world slowed down in that moment. I could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the decision being made in his eyes. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in some foreign battlefield fighting enemies of America, but in a Nevada desert, killed by one of our own for trying to do the right thing. The shot was deafeningly loud in the desert silence. Blood splashed across my face, warm and thick and metallic. I felt myself falling, the world spinning around me as I hit the ground hard. Everything went gray at the edges, sounds became muffled and distant. But as the darkness started closing in, I heard something that didn't make sense. Voices. Multiple voices. Shouting. Radio chatter. The sound of vehicles approaching fast across the desert. And then Kane's voice, but different now. Confused. Panicked. What the hell? How did you? This isn't possible. A new voice, authoritative and commanding. Admiral Marcus Kane, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. Through the haze of shock and disorientation, I realized something that made my heart race with a mixture of relief and vindication. The blood on my face wasn't mine. In the chaos of the moment, as my consciousness faded in and out, I caught fragments of what was happening around me. Kane's voice, no longer commanding but pleading. You don't understand. This is a mistake. I'm Admiral Marcus Kane. Check my credentials. Another voice, cold and professional. We know exactly who you are, Admiral. We've been monitoring your communications for the past 72 hours. We have recordings of everything. As the medics worked on me, and I gradually realized that the gunshot wound was superficial, that Kane's shot had grazed my temple and knocked me unconscious, but hadn't done any serious damage. I began to piece together what had happened. My encrypted transmission hadn't just reached Naval Special Warfare Command. It had triggered an immediate investigation that bypassed all normal channels. Within hours of receiving my evidence, a joint task force had been assembled to monitor Kane's activities and gather additional evidence. They'd been watching him for 3 days. Recording his conversations, tracking his movements, documenting his attempts to contact his criminal associates and warn them that their network had been compromised. And when he'd led me out into the desert with the intention of silencing me permanently, they'd followed. Every word of our conversation had been recorded. His confession, his justification, his admission of treason, all of it captured on multiple recording devices and witnessed by federal agents and military police. Kane's attempt to murder me had been the final piece of evidence they needed to ensure his conviction would stick. As they loaded me into the medical transport, I got one last look at Admiral Marcus Kane. He was handcuffed, surrounded by federal agents, his uniform already stripped of rank insignia. The man who had once commanded respect and fear from enemies and allies alike was now just another criminal being processed by the justice system he'd betrayed. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Without the authority of his rank, without the protection of his reputation, he was just a bitter old man who'd convinced himself that betrayal was patriotism. Our eyes met for a moment as they closed the ambulance doors, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Not anger, not defiance, but disappointment. Like somehow I was the one who had failed him, like my refusal to become complicit in his crimes was a personal betrayal of our relationship. Even then, even caught red-handed and facing life in prison, he couldn't accept that he was the villain in this story. The medical bay at Naval Medical Center Balboa was quiet and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. I woke up with a bandage wrapped around my head, for lines in my arms, and the kind of deep, bone-tired exhaustion that comes after surviving something that should have killed you. But I was alive. Wounded, but alive. And more importantly, Kane's criminal network was finished. The investigation that followed was extensive and thorough. Federal agents, military investigators, and intelligence analysts spent months unraveling the full scope of Kane's activities. What they found was even worse than what I documented in my initial transmission. Kane's criminal enterprise had been operational for over 3 years. He'd sold classified intelligence to foreign governments, facilitated weapons transfers to terrorist organizations, and orchestrated mission failures that had resulted in the deaths of American soldiers and intelligence assets. The money involved was staggering, millions of dollars in illegal payments that had been funneled through offshore accounts and shell corporations. But as Kane had claimed during our final confrontation, it wasn't entirely about personal enrichment. Much of the money had been used to fund unofficial operations, black budget activities that existed outside normal oversight and accountability. Kane had convinced himself that he was a patriot working outside the system for the greater good. In reality, he was a traitor who had caused immeasurable damage to national security while enriching himself and his associates. The trial was a media spectacle. Admiral Marcus Kane, decorated war hero turned criminal mastermind, facing charges of treason in a military tribunal. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating. Former subordinates, intelligence analysts, and federal agents all testified to the scope and scale of his crimes. Kane's defense was predictable. He claimed he was acting in the best interests of national security, that his actions were justified by the complex realities of modern warfare, that he was being scapegoated for decisions made at higher levels of government. None of it mattered. The evidence was too clear, the crimes too egregious, the betrayal too complete. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Kane showed no emotion. No surprise, no anger, no regret. Just the blank expression of a man who had finally run out of justifications for his actions. The sentencing was swift and severe. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dishonorable discharge from the United States Navy. Forfeiture of all military benefits and decorations. His service record, once a testament to heroism and sacrifice, was now a reminder of how far a man could fall when he lost sight of the principles he'd sworn to uphold. As I watched Kane being led away in shackles, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not for the criminal he'd become, but for the hero he'd once been. Somewhere along the way, the man who had earned 2 silver stars and a bronze star for valor had lost his way. He'd forgotten that the uniform he wore represented something bigger than himself, something more important than any mission or operation or strategic objective. He'd forgotten that honor isn't just about courage in battle. It's about integrity in the quiet moments when no one is watching. It's about doing the right thing even when the right thing is difficult, dangerous, or personally costly. Kane had chosen the easy path, the profitable path, the path that served his own interests rather than the interests of his country and his men. And in the end, that choice had cost him everything that had once made him a hero. 3 months after the trial, I was called to a ceremony at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters. I expected a routine commendation, maybe a letter of appreciation for my role in exposing Kane's criminal network. Instead, I found myself standing in front of a room full of senior officers, including the Admiral who had taken Kane's place as my commanding officer. On the table in front of them was a small blue box that I recognized immediately. "Chief Petty Officer," the Admiral began, "your actions in exposing and stopping a criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of our command structure represent the finest traditions of the United States Navy and the SEAL community. Your courage, integrity, and dedication to duty prevented further damage to our national security and saved countless lives." He opened the blue box, revealing the silver star inside. "It is my honor to present you with the Silver Star for gallantry in action against enemies of the United States. Your willingness to risk your life to expose treason and corruption exemplifies the highest ideals of military service." As he pinned the medal to my uniform, I thought about Kane. About the silver stars he'd once worn proudly, the decorations that had been stripped from him when his true nature was revealed. There was something poetic about receiving the same award that Kane had once earned legitimately, but had ultimately dishonored through his crimes. But this wasn't about Kane anymore. This was about the principle that had guided my actions from the beginning, the belief that the uniform we wear means something, that the oath we take is sacred, that the trust placed in us by our fellow Americans is not to be taken lightly or betrayed for personal gain. The ceremony was followed by a promotion ceremony. I was advanced to Senior Chief Petty Officer with orders to a new assignment as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. My new role would involve training the next generation of SEALs, teaching them not just the tactical skills they'd need to survive and succeed in combat, but the ethical foundation they'd need to remain true to their oath even in the darkest moments of their service. It was, in many ways, the perfect assignment for someone who had learned firsthand that the greatest threats to our mission don't always come from foreign enemies. Sometimes they come from within, from people who have forgotten why they put on the uniform in the first place. 6 months later, I received a letter from Cain. It was delivered through official channels, heavily screened and censored, but the core message was clear. He wanted to meet with me, to explain his actions, to somehow justify what he'd done and convince me that his motives had been pure even if his methods were questionable. I threw the letter away without reading it completely. There was nothing Cain could say that would change what had happened. No explanation that would justify his betrayal, no rationalization that would excuse his crimes, no appeal to patriotism that would make his treason acceptable. Cain had made his choices. He'd chosen profit over principle, personal gain over duty, criminal conspiracy over loyal service. Those choices had consequences, and no amount of explanation or justification could change that. But in one sense, Cain had been right about something during our final confrontation. The world is complicated. Gray areas exist between absolute right and absolute wrong. Military service sometimes requires difficult decisions, moral compromises, actions that exist in the shadows between heroism and pragmatism. The difference is that true warriors, true patriots, true SEALs understand that when you're operating in those gray areas, you hold yourself to an even higher standard, not a lower one. You accept that serving your country sometimes means sacrificing your own interests, your own comfort, your own safety for the greater good. Cain had inverted that principle. He'd used the complexity and moral ambiguity of military service as an excuse to serve himself rather than his country. He'd taken the trust and authority vested in him by the American people and used it to enrich himself and his criminal associates. That wasn't patriotism. That was treason, plain and simple. As I settled into my new role as an instructor, I made sure that every SEAL candidate who came through my courses understood this fundamental truth. The greatest enemy of military effectiveness isn't foreign terrorists or enemy governments. It's the corruption that can take root when warriors forget why they fight. I taught them about operational security, but I also taught them about moral courage. I trained them in advanced weapons systems, but I also trained them in ethical decision-making. I prepared them for combat operations, but I also prepared them to recognize and resist the kind of corruption that had infected Cain and threatened to destroy everything our unit had worked to build. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not one man's fall from grace, not one criminal's eventual capture and punishment, but the eternal struggle between those who serve with honor and those who serve only themselves. Cain thought he was smarter than the system. He thought his rank and reputation would protect him from consequences. He thought he could betray his oath and his country and somehow still claim to be a patriot. He was wrong about all of that. But the most important thing he was wrong about was this. He thought that corruption was stronger than integrity, that cynicism was more powerful than idealism, that those of us who still believed in honor and duty and service were naive fools who would eventually see the world his way. What he discovered, too late to save himself, was that integrity doesn't shout. It doesn't boast or posture or demand recognition. It simply endures. It outlasts corruption, outlasts cynicism, outlasts the rationalizations and justifications that criminals use to excuse their crimes. In the world of shadows where special operations forces operate, where life and death decisions are made in split seconds and the margin for error is measured in heartbeats, truth really is the only weapon that never jams. Cain forgot that lesson. He convinced himself that lies and betrayal and criminal conspiracy were tools he could use to serve some greater good. But in the end, those tools turned on him. The lies became too complex to maintain, the betrayals too numerous to hide, the criminal conspiracy too extensive to control. The truth, on the other hand, was simple and powerful and unstoppable. Once it was set in motion, once the evidence was transmitted and the investigation began, nothing Cain could do would stop it from reaching its inevitable conclusion. That's the real lesson of this story. Not that bad people sometimes do bad things, that's obvious. The lesson is that good people, people with integrity and courage and a genuine commitment to serving something bigger than themselves, will ultimately prevail over corruption and betrayal and treason. It's not always easy. It's not always quick. It often requires personal sacrifice, physical danger, and the kind of moral courage that most people never have to demonstrate. But in the end, honor wins. Truth wins. The principles we swear to defend when we put on this uniform prove stronger than the temptations that can lead even decorated heroes astray. Cain learned that lesson too late to save his career, his freedom, or his legacy. But his downfall serves as a reminder to every warrior, every SEAL, every person who has taken an oath to serve their country. The uniform you wear is more than cloth and thread. The rank you hold is more than medal and ribbon. The trust placed in you is more than words on a page. These things are sacred. They represent the hopes and dreams and sacrifices of millions of Americans who depend on us to keep them safe, to defend their freedom, to serve with honor even when no one is watching. Admiral Marcus Cain forgot that. He paid the price for that forgetfulness with everything he once held dear. I haven't forgotten. And as long as I wear this uniform, as long as I carry this trident, as long as I draw breath in service to this great nation, I never will. What do you think? Did justice win that day in the Nevada desert, or was it just another mission disguised as moral righteousness? Was Cain a traitor who got what he deserved, or a complicated man who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances? Comment below and let me know where you stand. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about the price of honor, the cost of betrayal, and the eternal struggle between those who serve with integrity and those who serve only themselves. Because sometimes, in a world full of shadows and moral ambiguity and impossible choices, the deadliest weapon really is honor. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating an enemy on some foreign battlefield, but refusing to become the enemy yourself. That's a lesson Admiral Marcus Cain learned too late. It's a lesson I hope none of us ever forget.